Well, good evening, everybody. I always like to start these things promptly on 7 o'clock if I can. Welcome to the Society of Army Historical Research's online talks, the September talk. And we've got a really good sign up for this evening. Over 80 people have signed up. And I know that I'm going to bore some people who are regular attenders. But what I'd like to do at the start of these evenings is just go through some housekeeping. It gives people the opportunity to enter the room and make themselves comfortable. If you'd like to introduce yourselves in the chat box, please do so. Demio, the platform that we use, works on the strength of your internet connection. So if you are having any problems this evening with either your audio or your video feed, then there are a number of immediate action drills or IA drills that you can employ to correct that. And that's what I always try to run through at the start of these sessions. So the first IA drill that you can employ is simply to refresh your page. Now, I always say that, and some people I know say, well, how do you do that? Well, if you look to the top left-hand corner of your browser window, you should see an incomplete circle with an arrow on it. If you click on that, that's what refreshes your page. And that will often sort out any video or audio problems that you might have. If that doesn't work, then you can use what I always call the IT crowd solution, which is to close the window down and then come back using the same unique link that you used to join this evening. And if those two IA drills don't work, then the third IA drill you can employ, if you have the luxury of being able to access a different browser, is to use a different browser. So Demio works with Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and Microsoft Edge. This evening I'm using Chrome, but I also have access to Safari. So if I have a problem with the Chrome browser, then I can always use the link that I've got to come back in using the Safari browser. So those are the three IA drills that you can employ. And if you are having any problems with video or audio, then those should sort it. If, unfortunately, you are still struggling, then you are guaranteed a copy of the recording, which goes out automatically to everybody who has registered this evening, sometime this evening, and certainly by first thing tomorrow morning. So I'm going to ask tonight's speaker, Andrew Bamford, to come up onto the stage, and then I will introduce him. And when I've done the introductions, I will leave him to carry out the talk. And then at the end of the talk, I will run a question and answer session. And what we like to ask people to do is, if a question occurs to you during Andrew's talk, then please start typing it in then and then. If Andrew subsequently covers the point you're asking about in his talk, then clearly I won't put the question to him. But it will save some time at the end, so you're not all rushing to typing your questions. Well, Andrew is known to many of us as the current secretary of the Society, and also one of 5 commissioning editors for Hellion. He did his PhD at University of Leeds, which was my old alma mater. And his area of expertise is the long 18th century. There are many things I could say about Andrew that I won't now, because he's going to do some of his own introductions. But I can never listen to his voice without immediately thinking of Alan Bennett. Now, I don't know why. It's the voice. It's that Yorkshire.
You're not the first to say that, Dudley.
Okay. So Jonathan thinks my mic is on mute. I think everyone else can hear me. So Jonathan, you might want to use that IA drill that I gave it, which is to refresh your page. Anyway, I'm going to leave the stage and hand over to to Andrew. I'm going to put his slides up. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Dudley. I will before we start. I should say until 6 or 7 weeks ago, tonight was going to be John Peaty on the Battle of Alam Halfa, but John is still convalescing from some fairly major surgery, and I ended up stepping in. Those of you who know John will be pleased to know he is well on the road to recovery, but he's determined, having been thwarted last year by royal mourning and thwarted this year by his surgery, that you're definitely going to get the Battle of Alam Halfa for the 82nd anniversary next year. So put that date in your diaries now. Okay, so at slightly short notice, I've come in to do this talk on something that is very much still a work in progress for me. The last time I spoke to the Society and guests, we got something that I was dredging back from work that was done some time ago. This is very much my current evenings and weekends project, and it's not entirely finished. And I suspect when we get to the Q&A, I may well have to say I don't know on a few occasions, or I don't know yet. And I'm very hopeful, in fact, that some of the expertise in the audience may help me fill some of the gaps in ongoing research. So with that caveat, so how have I, as somebody who started off as a Napoleonic historian and ended up talking about the 7 Years' War? And I've said a tale of two books. The first of the two is a bit of a shameless plug. My own first book, which was the book of my thesis, and which looked at how the British Army was organised, and particularly how the regimental system was organised in the Napoleonic Wars. And one of the takeaways from that is that the system that was in force was really the system that had been evolved and perfected in the wars of the 18th century. And you can read at length whether I think it was suitable or not for the sort of war the British Army was fighting after 1808 in the book, if you so desire. But particularly a lot of the reforms, a lot of the systems that were in force then go back to the reforms of the Duke of Cumberland in the 1740s and 50s. And so I thought, as well as allowing me to indulge an interest in the earlier period, particularly now my current job with Hellion enables me to spend a lot more time on 18th century matters, I thought it would be interesting to look at that era. But the reason I've hit on this particular topic is down to the other book, which isn't necessarily a title I would recommend. It was put together by some bored Victorian staff officers who didn't always know a great deal about some of the things they were talking about, but it does give a potted summary of various less well-known expeditions that the British Army was engaged in the long 18th century. Starts with Lorient in 1746, which I'm going to be talking about at a conference I'm running in a couple of months, and it goes all the way through to Bergen op Zoom in 1814, which is why I initially picked it up. And it was reading it then that I realised that there were these pretty major operations that were carried out in 1758, and there were place names I recognised from family holidays: Cherbourg, St Malo, Granville. I spent a lot of childhood holidays, and I still spend holidays now in Normandy and Brittany. It's one of my favourite parts of the world. But I had no idea that there'd been a British military presence there, and so. As one does, I fell down a rabbit hole, and as I say, it ended up becoming the next project. And I wouldn't say I've completed all the research for it, as I say, it's very much ongoing. But what I have done is visited just about all the places that are relevant to it in France at great personal cost and hardship, as you can see. I thought it would be nice to do this talk a little bit by way of a virtual battlefield tour, and I had it in mind for a while, and then we got such a stunningly good virtual battlefield tour with the talk in the spring on Spion-Kop that I felt a little bit like this was a slightly feeble effort, and it was just going to be my holiday snaps. But the other thing that I've brought out to support the story that I'm going to tell are some of the amazing maps and diagrams from the Royal Collection that Dr. Yolanda Hodgson has brilliantly curated, and to which the Society gave her one of her inaugural fellowships, so that there are some excellent period images to go with my photographs. The first of the maps then is actually nothing to do with France. This is the encampment on the Isle of Wight, where the troops are being assembled. I'm going to put that there because you don't want to sit looking at a picture of me drinking a glass of wine for much longer, I suspect. But I just want to go a little bit into the deep background before I start on the composition of the force that took part in these operations, and really just explain why the British Army was with, of course, the support of the Royal Navy, was carrying out these operations, these descents, as they were called, against various targets in France. This is probably a fairly quick and dirty political summary, so forgive me if I skate over the details. But the essence of it was Britain, in the early part of the 7 Years' War, it was felt politically inappropriate to send troops to join the fighting, British troops to join the fighting in Germany, which was perceived by the faction surrounding the Elder Pitt to be essentially propping up King George in his capacity as Elector of Hanover, rather than pursuing truly British interests, which it was felt should be directed against the French Empire and towards the expansion of Britain's imperial presence, and particularly in North America, where the fighting had kicked off even before the war had officially begun. And of course, troops were sent out there. And at the same time, sending troops to Germany when there was the risk of a French invasion, which was at least a possibility until Hawke's victory at Quiberon in 59, was problematic. So troops were being held at home, and then it was a question of what to do with them. I mean, I was struck by the interesting parallel. I was catching up on last month's talk, which unfortunately I wasn't available to listen to live. And it struck me there, the phrase raiding for the sake of raiding was mentioned with respect to Dieppe. And I think there was a little bit of that. The theory, and certainly the argument that was put to Britain's German allies, was that by attacking targets on the French coast, the French would have to keep garrisons there to defend them. They would, with luck, be forced to withdraw troops from Germany, and thus, although Prussia and Hanover could not be supported directly, the British Army could nevertheless serve as a useful distraction, and by acting as a sort of army in being to keep the French tied down at home. To some extent, I suspect a convenient excuse, but that was at least the logic. And these sort of attacks were hardly new. They're certainly going back to the 9 Years' War. We'd had a go at St Malo. We'd had a go at Brest. In the Austrian Succession War, we'd had a go at Lorient, as I mentioned, and so it was a fairly well tried and tested strategy. And when the 7 Years' War began in earnest in Europe, an operation in 1757 was mounted against Rochefort down on the Biscay coast and the Basque Roads. That is I do intend ultimately to cover that in the what I hope will eventually be the book of the film when I get down to actually be able to write something myself again. But I haven't actually had a chance to get down to see the sites there yet. That was going to be our foreign trip in the year that COVID happened, and we haven't had a chance to reschedule it yet. So I don't want to talk too much about that, not least because in terms of military operations, there effectively weren't any. The operation there was mounted because a British engineer officer had carried out a bit of a discreet recce of the place during the peace and felt it was ripe for attack. But when a landing force, 10 battalions and some cavalry detachments turned up aboard transports, it belatedly occurred to those in command that the French might well have been building more defences in the intervening years, and they sort of took themselves out of landing any troops. The two useful outcomes from that operation, one was that a certain James Wolfe, who was a staff officer there, had his how not to do it moment that he was able to implement the lessons of across the Atlantic at Louisbourg and Quebec, but also that the need for specialised landing boats was recognised, and those were used in the operations the following year that I'm going to talk about. And I really should have put a picture up, and I'm kicking myself that I didn't. But there are models in some of the, I think it's one of the National Maritime Museum collection. And if you can imagine a sort of a flat bottom rowing boat with a space for oars at the side and troops down the middle, you'll not be far off. But just to put some context into the size of force that we're looking at here, this is the encampment, as I say, on the Isle of Wight, with the army being assembled. We're looking at a brigade of foot guards, 4 brigades of line infantry, a sort of demi-brigade of combined grenadiers pulled out of the line, and the equivalent of a regiment's worth of light cavalry. These are the light troops that had been raised for the Dragoon and Dragoon Guard regiments as one of our first serious attempts at light cavalry. And having raised them, they were promptly all detached from their regiments and used for special duties like this. A few of them had gone to Rochefort and never got off the boat. And as I say, about a regiment's worth equivalent of were attached to this force. So this is not a small army. I mean, this is bigger than the army that Amherst has at Louisbourg. This is a bigger army than Wolfe has at Quebec. It's a bigger British contingent than fights at Minden, although of course they were Allied troops there. So this is one of Britain's major efforts in the first half of the 7 Years' War in Europe. I mean, it's not really until 1760-61 that we start seeing this sort of size commitment of forces to Germany, when, of course, as I said earlier, the invasion threat has gone and troops can be released. The officer appointed to command is a name surely intended to strike fear into any Frenchman, the Duke of Marlborough. Of course, not the Duke of Marlborough, who had been dead for some time by then. This is the third Duke, who I have to say seems to have been a fairly undistinguished officer. His only active service, as far as I can tell, was watching Dettingen happen from a distance, because he was commanding the guards and they were kept in reserve at that battle. But his seniority as a lieutenant general put him in command. And I should say, I've got my crib notes here, because numbers and dates are always problematic for me in terms of memory. So I should have said 13,000 to give you a number for the troops committed. And his second in command, Lord George Sackville, soon to be known as the Coward of Minden, but also amongst the staff officers like Granby and Waldegrave, who do go on to distinguish themselves in Germany. And as I say, they're assembled on the Isle of Wight, and the initial target is St Malo in northern Brittany, which was a major French privateering base. I nearly said is. I suspect they still market themselves as the city of corsairs. It's their thing. So a target which could usefully be attacked, but also quite a well-defended one, and one which had foiled an Anglo-Dutch attempt, as I mentioned earlier, in the 9 Years' War. Famously, the only casualty of that attack was an unfortunate cat that was caught in an explosion. So clearly going back with a large force seemed to be the way to do it. They sail from the Solent on the 1st of June 58. And they arrive off the coast of France at Cancale, some way to the east of St Malo, on the 5th, and have landed by the end of the following day. Cancale is still today, as I said again, it's been a terrible hardship conducting all this on the spot research. Cancale is today one of the seafood capitals of northern France, very famous for its oysters. And apparently back in the day, the British troops were cooking up pots of oysters on the beach while they were waiting to move inland. This is a view along what's now the seafront of the resort town. But if you can see from the period sketch map, Cancale village, as is some way up inland on the right of the sketch there. And the photograph is actually taken, if you look about a third of the way in along the shoreline from the right. There's a point where the land there's a coast turns inland rather, and if you can just make out the caption along the beach of La Houle, that's where that's where the The picture is the photograph that you saw and briefly saw again just now is looking towards, and as you can also see there, the army gets ashore and encamps itself, and indeed one of the brigades is left to hold the breachhead while the remainder of the army sets off to move on St Malo, which, as you can see from the map here, which was done to illustrate the campaign, is somewhere along the coast. They march towards the target on the 7th, but just to zoom in, you can see really how well defended a target it is. The city itself is walled and bastioned, and it's accessible only by a very narrow spit of land. I mean, the sandbanks and so forth that you can see there are now the harbour, but there are more bridges and so forth. But the main land approach along the coast is still the only real way to move on foot, and certainly was the only way to do so then. And I think it's fairly obvious that to attack a fortification down a narrow spit of land like that is asking for trouble. You can see there, this is looking across the harbour from Saint-Savant, or Saint-Savant as they've called it on the period map, and you can see there the only way that the town is attached to the rest of France is the little strip on the far right. I should say as well, it was largely flattened by the Americans in the process of them liberating it in the Second World War, but rebuilt on the same plan. So it's got a slightly drab look where they've used the same stone for just about everything. But the plan of the fortifications is essentially as they were in the 18th century. So you've got the main fortifications there, which certainly are a fairly difficult nut to crack, with heavy artillery on the walls and a resolute garrison, and Mrs. Bamford very helpfully playing the part of the resolute garrison there, posing on one of the cannon. And just to make it difficult for the navy to offer any help, not only are there the guns on the walls themselves, but there are fortifications. I'll go back quickly. You can see Fort Royal and then the Petit Bay and Grand Bay fortifications further off. So getting in with warships is going to be difficult, and there's no real attempt to do that. Fort Royal is now inevitably Fort National for the Republic. I'm not sure if it was ever Fort Imperial in the relevant interval. It's open to the public. It's a lovely little museum. Dudley was just bemoaning when we were chatting before I went on that he's never had a chance to go to St Malo. I mean, I would certainly recommend it as a destination for people who like history, and particularly maritime history. But the fort is delightful. As somebody who's dabbled in reenactment, it would be a lovely place to garrison with a couple of dozen people for a weekend if the city authorities would ever let you play with it. But certainly in terms of being an obstacle to an attack, it adds another layer. And Marlborough and his associates quickly realised that they're not in an ideal situation here, and that an attack on the main town is out of the question. What they do instead, therefore, in order to make something of the attempt, is they carry out a couple of nighttime operations using the cavalry and some of the grenadiers to burn the shipping in the harbour on the Saint-Savant side, away from the main fortress defences. One of the interesting things, there's a claim, this is, I say, I'm still sorting out details, particularly on the naval side here, which I'm not a naval historian, I sort of take an interest. The accounts would suggest amongst the vessels destroyed was a 50-gun warship. Now, the definitive Big Seaforth book of the French Royal Navy and its ships mentions no warship of any size at all lost in these circumstances. So quite what that was, whether that's a bit of exaggeration or it was perhaps an Indiaman or something of that sort. But certainly a fair proportion of shipping is destroyed in those two operations. But they pretty much amount to the only significant blow that is scored. And in due course, the army therefore marches back to Cancale and re-embarks. There was some consideration against going for other targets. Granville, which I mentioned, which is in Normandy, the southern end of the Cotentin Peninsula on the Atlantic side, was wreckage. Cherbourg was considered, but it was felt that the weather and the French defences were such that there wasn't going to be any point in sending the troops ashore there either, and they returned to the Isle of Wight. Just excuse me. So, no great success so far, but no disastrous failure either. By this point, Britain is beginning to make a military commitment to Germany, and Marlborough has clearly had enough of messing about in boats and manages to pull rank and get himself assigned to that command, and quite a few of his senior officers follow him, and one of the brigades of infantry is taken away and redeployed to Germany. And the command of the remaining force is given to Lieutenant General Thomas Bligh, who had seen a rather more active career as a brigadier in the Austrian Succession War in Flanders, but who was perhaps getting a little long in the tooth to be exercising such a major command. He'd originally been slated to go to Germany, so quite what he felt about this sudden change in role is well, if it's recorded, it's not yet known to me. But certainly he took the command and got on with it. And rather than going back to St Malo, they decided to have another go at Cherbourg. And this is really the unsung success of the whole thing, because of all the operations, really including some of the precursor ones that I mentioned as well. This is the only one that achieves anything like the objectives that is assigned to it. I haven't put any photographs up for Cherbourg. I have been several times. The difficulty is that the harbour that you see now is the result of a lot of work under the two French imperial eras, and there is very little that remotely resembles the town and harbour that were attacked in 1758. I've attempted several times on the ferry coming in and out to get a good panorama of the coast, and failed because the light's always been bad. So rather than put a bad photograph up, I'm relying just on a period map here. If you'll forgive me, I checked my dates. So they sail on the 31st of July. Under Bligh, with Prince Edward, Duke of York, embarked as a volunteer. So clearly, this is still quite the prestige operation. Operations against Cherbourg begin on the 7th of August, and the troops land a little way along the coast. This where are we looking? So away to the right-hand side of the image. It's confusing because it's orientated with the south at the top. Marching overland and begin operations, and the town is taken fairly swiftly. The fortifications are reasonably minor, and it is then thoroughly sacked, and the harbour installations demolished. The French, true to the hopes of the plan, begin to pull in their forces. Nobody from the war in Germany. That's a false hope, I think, all along. But certainly local reserves are pulled in and assembled, and I think very wisely withdraws his troops, having achieved quite an impressive success at very little cost. And I suspect if it had all ended there and they'd gone home and in due course redeployed to Germany, we'd probably say, Pitt's descent's probably not a bad policy, kept the French occupied. Unfortunately, it's decided to go and have another go at St Malo, and this is where things get a bit more dramatic and interesting, and unfortunately start to turn pear-shaped. So they've tried landing with the previous attempt at Cancale, and have realised that attacking St Malo from that side isn't really viable. The alternative, therefore, the only alternative is to land the other side, which they do on, give me again with the date, on the 4th of September at the Bay of Saint-Lunaire. Those of you who recall the map that I put up, I'll not go back through a dozen slides to remind you, but I've got a picture that will serve the same purpose in a minute. We'll perhaps remember that there is a large river between the new landing point and the town of St Malo, and it really is quite the riverance, really quite an impressive obstacle. When I went there on the what's now the resort of Dinard, a cruise company had very kindly parked a dirty great liner in the middle of it, just to really give a sense of the scale. So certainly any sort of attack across the water is absolutely out. The alternative, therefore, would be to march a considerable way inland to Dinan, so towards the French troops in the area, to commit the army to a lengthy inland operation, and then march back down the other side, which would still only get you back to Saint-Savin, where they burnt the ships on the previous expedition, which is the buildings you can see in the photograph to the left of the cruise liner, which really still wouldn't leave them any better off than the attempt under Marlborough. So quite what they were thinking, I'm not sure. I suspect it was a do something moment, and it's quite quickly realised that actually there isn't a practical operation that can be mounted from this position, and that the army needs to withdraw. The difficulty is that by this time the weather's changed, and the fairly open bay at Saint-Lunaire, and there are a whole string of these bays along this stretch of coast, but that it's deemed that they're all too exposed to the weather, and that the closest safe anchorage for the fleet is round at the Baie de Saint-Cast, which on the map here, and again we've got north at the bottom and south at the top, so forgive the strange orientation, but is on the bottom right hand side of the map, where the coast is, where the coast follows around, and you can see there's a more of an inland stretch there, so the ships can shelter from the weather in the water there, and get the troops off. But this is a march of several days, and as you can see, there are a couple of major rivers that are going to need crossing on the way. So again, the troops have been ashore a few days. The French are already gathering. The army has now got to march several days through enemy-held territory. Unfriendly territory is perhaps the fairest way. They're already being harassed by the local Coast Guard militia, and indeed the local armed peasantry. And they've now got to do this with the threat of a French force assembling inland to come and cut them off. But this is the only option. The fleet can't remain off Saint-Lunaire. And so they begin to march. The major obstacle, which really begins to hold things up, is the River Arguinon, shown here at low tide, which of course they had to wait for in order to get across. The bridge is a modern addition. There was no bridge there. There was a ford in 1758, and they arrived there they march off on the 8th of September, and they arrive at the Arguinon they arrive there they can't cross until the 9th, when they're waiting for the tidal conditions. And that's the river looking from the crossing point down. So the main body of the army crosses somewhere round about here, and the Guards Brigade carries out a flank operation and crosses lower down somewhere here, and continue the march on what I described. I think this is Corporal Todd. I should really have noted down. If you're not familiar, I should explain. Corporal Todd's memoirs, diary, journal, edited, of course, by, or co-edited by JSAHR's current editor, Dr. Andrew Cormack, one of the great eyewitness accounts from a private soldier in the 18th century. And I think it's him I'm quoting on this occasion. I've got a couple more quotes from him later on. Very close, bad rows, and they're certainly very, very tight lanes even now. And obviously they're even tighter and more awkward when you never know whether there's going to be an angry Breton behind the next hedge with a fowling piece, or indeed the local militia with their muskets, and the army is being harassed as they move up through this terrain, and it becomes quite a messy operation. This is one of the things I really want to look into in a bit more detail, because it strikes me that this quite quickly becomes an army that begins to lose its discipline during these operations. And I think part of the problem is that they're being actively encouraged as part of the operation to sack those French properties that aren't able to pay protection money. And I don't think that's too strong a term. It is essentially, you pay up and we'll lead you a guard and safe conduct, or we'll put a torch to the place. And a couple of quotes there from Todd, who seems to have been quite disgusted with the whole thing. But equally, you get the impression, this is an army that's, by the sounds of things, had great fun smashing up Cherbourg, and has got quite used to taking their frustrations out on the French, and are even more likely to do so now because they're being shot at by these people. And thinking back even to this is actually an anecdote, a longer anecdote from Todd, that took place on the first expedition when they were coming overland from the Cancale side, of a case of a French woman being raped by a redcoat and rescued by another, but in the confusion it's the guy who's rescued her who was summarily strung up by the provost. And I need to corroborate that from other sources if I can, but
I think we've lost Andrew for a second. Let's give him the opportunity to come back. Can you all hear me? So someone give me a thumbs up that you can hear me at least. Yeah, thanks, Phil. This sometimes happens, particularly when you're in the deepest wilds of Yorkshire, as Andrew is. Sometimes your internet drops out, so we'll just wait for him to come back. Yeah, I've never been to St Malo. I'd love to have gone there. It's on my next visits to northern France. It's on my list. I can see he's desperately trying to get back in, and here he is. So I'll leave the stage, Andrew. And
thank you, Dudley. Sorry about that. Yeah, as you were saying, a connectivity issue, I suspect. Very sorry. I'm not quite sure where I got cut off there, but rather than lose too much time, I suspect an army that wasn't as well disciplined as it should have been, and certainly that aspect is something that I want to look into in more detail, and see if we can establish the truth behind some of the stories that Todd has to tell, and so what that all says about the state of the British Army at this point. Anyway, moving on with the narrative before the internet gods attack me again. So this is the point that they're aiming for, having got across the river. This is by de Soncast, which, as you can see from the period drawing, is a good sheltered anchorage with a substantial beach to get the troops off. I mean, today it's a seaside resort. It became, from the Edwardian era. As you can see there from the period version, the town, much as with Cancale, the original town is further inland, and these days it's stretched down to the seafront, and you'll see from some of the photographs where the battle took place that it's now rather more built up than this. But there's enough of the terrain hasn't been built over that to give us a good idea of the battle that took place. the British troops initially marched to a town inland, Matignon, which one on the far right of this is captioned as a village. I suspect it's in the right direction. I suspect it's meant to indicate that, and certainly if you take that as a point of reference, you're not going to go far off. So they concentrate in land first. Oh, sorry, we've gone too far. Concentrate in land first of all, and then begin to move down from there to secure the re-embarkation point with the fleet waiting offshore. The French have got Coast Guard batteries all along this stretch of coast, and there are two. They're number 2 on this image, if you can make them out, on the main headland, the Point de Saint-Cast, on the right hand side. And so the embarkation is intended to take place on the 11th of September, and on the night of the 10th into the 11th. A detachment from the Coldstream Guards is sent to take out the batteries, which they do, and they throw the cannon into the sea. And in recent years, one of the cannon has been recovered and rather helpfully placed on the original battery site to give you a good idea of where it was, which you can see there. And then that's commanding or would have been commanding the beach over which the troops had re-embarked. This is from a little bit lower than the actual position of the cannon now, but looking in the same direction past what's now the fishing harbour, which is just off to the right of the photograph, and looking at the beach. And as you can see there now, that's got a slew of hotels across it that, of course, weren't there in 1758, but it still gives you a good idea of the bay. The French, however, have not been idle. The modestly dressed gentleman in the painting is the Duc d'Aiguillon, the governor of Brittany, and he has been assiduously assembling the local garrisons into quite an impressive field army. We're not far off parity of forces, but in fact, if you include the 5,000 or 6,000 militia and volunteers, he's probably got more troops than Bligh, even if he lacks the regular, doesn't have as many regular troops. He moves on towards Matignon as the British pull out, and then occupies the high ground above Saint-Cast, and establishes himself at a windmill, Moulin Anne, which is still standing. Apparently, he uses it as an observation post for most of the day, and apparently by the end of it, he's covered in flour. So we have to hope he wasn't wearing quite as grand a uniform as the one he's shown in the painting. But it's a pretty good place for a command post. This is looking down. Obviously, you can't climb the windmill these days, but this is looking down from the same field. You can just through the trees on the left of the photograph see the modern harbour of Saint-Cast, and the headland above that is the position that you saw just a moment ago with the gun battery. And so the beach that the British are re-embarking from is down and hidden in the trees. And this is a fairly good commanding position, and Aiguillon can see what's going on. And what's mostly going on is redcoats getting into boats and safely being pulled out. Rather conveniently for the British, the French have thrown up as coastal defences not only gun batteries but also entrenchments. And so along the top of the line of the beach are a series of positions which the British are able to reverse and use to position a rear guard, which is composed of the Grenadiers and half a battalion of Coldstream under Major General Dury, who is the commander of the Guards Brigade, and I've gone completely blank on the officer's name. I ought to know because his family from Colonel Booth, Lieutenant Colonel Boothby of the 30th, who's commanding the 2 Grenadier battalions, and they're left to hold the line of entrenchments while the rest of the troops embark. And Aiguillon is essentially waiting for his moment. I think probably wisely, he doesn't want to attack Bligh's entire army. He even if he has numbers, he doesn't have the numbers of regulars, as I've said. I mean, one of the great what ifs is what if Bligh kept all his troops on shore and taken the fight to the French? Could he have driven them off long enough to embark completely unhindered in a bit of a more at Corunna scenario? We might yet be talking about the great British victory in the Battle of Matignon. But he doesn't take that course of action. And so what the French commander very cleverly does is he waits until there aren't very many redcoats left, and he does have superiority, and he only then goes on the attack. And it's still a risky prospect. The smaller ships of the fleet are inshore covering the embarkation. There are bomb catchers and some of the small cutters and so forth that are able to work quite closely in and bring the French under fire as they start to come down off the high ground. But we're down to a couple of thousand grenadiers and guardsmen holding out along the top of the beach. This then would be the view from that rearguard position. In terms of the terrain, at least you can see the ground begins to drop away from what were the sand dunes, and you've got quite a flat plain before it starts to rise up. And perhaps more obviously from the French side, this would be the attackers' point of view of the same positions. All the streets are now named after regiments that took part in the battle on the French side. They're awfully proud there of their victory, although the Bretons will tell you it was a Breton victory won by the brave Breton volunteers, and the French regular army might just have been there possibly, but in reality the honours were somewhat the other way around. So there's your attacker's eye view. And there, as I say, are the two rearguard commanders, Dury and Boothby. Dury, just to digress, because I like the story, and the papers were sent by a good friend of mine, Alex Burns, in the States, who looked them up in NAM. Dury has felt obliged. He had, I suspect, had a bit of a premonition before going on campaign, and has felt obliged to write a letter to Mrs. Dury, which goes something like, "In the event that anything should happen to me, I probably ought to mention that I've had this mistress and a second family that you don't know about, and I'd really be rather grateful if you made financial provision for them," which I can't imagine was the easiest letter for his wife to receive. But clearly he wanted to make sure his affairs were in order before he got in the way of an angry Frenchman. So he's the guy in command on the beach with the rear guard. And he and his troops were initially successful in driving the French back and at least holding the position. And unfortunately, certainly if we believe Todd, but it seems to be corroborated by the other accounts, they get a bit carried away and begin to go after the French as they fall back from that initial failed attack. And this, of course, removes them from the defensive positions they've occupied. It removes them from the benefit of the naval gunfire, and it enables the French to come back and catch them out of the fortifications. And this is the point that things really start to go wrong. Todd, as you can see there, claims that it was on General. He calls him Drury. It seems to be a common misspelling, but I'm assured that Dury is the correct spelling. However you spell it, that it was the general's orders that they left the positions, but certainly whoever's orders they were, they did indeed leave them, and the French take advantage of that. And it's really now a case of the British being driven back onto the beach and having to get these men off under quite heavy, increasingly heavy French attack. This is the beach or the end of the beach to which they were driven as the French broke onto it. And unfortunately, what also happens is that one of the French flanking columns with the Volontaires Étrangères and a few other units get onto the headland that you can see there beyond the beach, the Point de la Garde, and are actually able to be firing down from there onto the redcoats as they're struggling to get into the boats. The Navy is still doing a brilliant job of trying to get the troops off under fire, but it's becoming a more and more of a sticky situation. You can see now, looking down from the French position on the point, that they're effectively able to fire into the back of the troops on the beach. And it all really collapses at that point. Dury at some point in the proceedings is killed. Boothby has to swim for it along with the last of the survivors, but quite a large proportion of the rear guard is cut off and taken prisoner, and the rest of the army really can do nothing more than watch from the transport ships as their colleagues are cut up. So really not the best ending at all. So as the French depiction of the battle, I mean it's one of those brilliant composite accounts that tries to show the entire battle in one image. So don't take it too much as gospel. And I'm fairly sure that the sunken sloop or frigate or whatever it is in the middle of the picture is an invention. But you can see the troops in the water. You can see the frigates and bomb catchers putting in the covering fire. And you can see the French on the high ground there firing down to the men in the water as they try and flee. So all rather unfortunate. I think all credit to the French and to Aguilon, who does the right thing under the circumstances and takes every advantage of the mistakes that Bligh and Dury make in acting as they do. I think we have to give the French full credit for the victory, even if we also want to give the rear guard credit for putting up a good fight. But insofar as it's a view from anywhere, this is essentially the view from here, as it was in 1758, and really the sort of the denouement of the evacuation. Casualties, as you can see, fairly heavy. I mean, from a rear guard of 2,000 or 3,000, that's fairly substantial losses. The Navy take a fair number of casualties in trying to get the troops off. I've said at least 4 prisoners of war. The account mentions 4 officers taken prisoner. I can't yet find out if there were any prisoners taken from the ordinary seamen. I assume if 4 officers were captured, then at least a few sailors would have been with them as well. I can't conceive quite why 4 naval officers would have been without any support. So I suspect the naval casualties are actually a little larger in terms of prisoners than the list that I've got there. As I say, I think tribute to the fight that's put up both by the rear guard and the fire support they get from the Navy, that the French don't get off lightly. But this by no means a bloody nose, and I think, as I say, a fairly clear cut French success. We've got here the Cimetière aux Braves, where the French fallen were laid to rest. It sadly, unfortunately, subsequently became a cholera graveyard, so not too much respect shown there, but it has been restored in more recent years. I can't imagine the British casualties were given anything like the same burial. They had not endeared themselves to the locals by their conduct. Although interestingly, the men who were left behind, as I mentioned earlier, if you paid the army off to not burn your chateau and you were left some redcoats to guard it, those men were all returned under flags of truce. So there was a certain amount of respect for the laws of war. But the locals were certainly not happy about the way that they'd been treated. And as I said again, in terms of local mythology, it is a great Breton victory in which the French only might have helped slightly. And there's the stained glass in the local church there, which depicts the Breton volunteers in the foreground to the left in their national costume. And in subsequent years, under the Second Empire, a very grand column erected to mark the French triumph. So really, yes, all rather embarrassing for us, and unsurprisingly, it ends the policy of dissents. There are to be no more. There had been a court of inquiry after the Rochefort debacle the previous year, and initially there was intended to be another one, and various papers were pulled in, and if I can find out where they've all gone, it will make my research an awful lot easier. The story is always that the papers, that is, were subsequently burnt on the king's orders because the whole affair was so utterly embarrassing, not least because one of his grandsons had been on board one of the ships. So that may or may not be true, in which case there are some gaps in the record left to be filled. We do eventually go raiding a buccaneering again in the 7 Years' War, and troops are sent to capture Belle-Île towards the end of the war. But crucially, Belle-Île is, of course, an island, and the options for a French counter-attack of the sort that had led to the Battle of Soncast and the disaster that I've just outlined for you don't really apply, and that is successfully held until the peace. But in terms of operations against mainland France, this is it so far as this war is concerned, and probably very wisely too. And ultimately, a number of the troops do eventually make their way to the war in Germany. So that really is the end of that. I'd be happy to take any questions. As I say, the answer may well be, I don't know yet. I'm still looking, but if I can offer anything, I'll be happy to do so.
Yeah, sorry for the delay on getting back on stage.
Don't worry, you lost me completely. So,
Andrew, thank you so much for that. What I really like about the Society's online talks is I'm primarily a historian of the 20th century. And I learned so much from these talks. And I'm learning more and more about amphibious attacks prior to the 20th century. Carol Duval in May took us through Abercrombie's attack at Aboukir. And recently I was in Gallipoli when we were still taking soldiers ashore in rowing boats. So how were the soldiers taken ashore in these attacks? Was it simply the Navy rowing them in?
Pretty much, yeah. As I say, after Rochefort, they had developed, I say landing craft is perhaps overstating it. We're not talking a ramp off the bow or anything, but oared craft designed for transporting soldiers rather than just using the ship's boats, which obviously enabled more men to be moved more quickly. But yeah, essentially, say you're looking at a row of oarsmen on either side, and a couple of files of soldiers sat in the middle, and run it around and jump over the front and away up the beach. Or obviously, in the case of Soncast, the reverse, and be pleased you've got off in time.
So Samuel's asked, going back to your initial map of Isle of Wight, do we know who drew the map for the camp on the Isle of Wight? Was it by chance the engineers William Roy or David Dundas?
It will almost certainly have been one of the two of them. They're all on the Royal Collection website, which, if I can get into the chat myself, I can probably put a link up to now. But off the top of my head, I could not tell you which of the two it would be. But yes, I mean, if you're not familiar with this resource, it's absolutely... I've lost the chat. Give me a moment. It's absolutely brilliant, and all credit to Yo Hodson for the work that she did in the curating of it, because it's an amazing resource.
Yeah, I did check to see if Yo was in the audience this evening. She's not, but if she had been, I would have asked her directly.
Yes, she could have certainly answered it for you, I'm sure, from her knowledge. But yes, it will certainly, almost certainly, be one of the other of those two who were responsible between them, I think, for most of the cartography.
Sam's asked another question, which there's a lot of reports on the infantry training going on at the Isle of Wight. Is there any information on the training undertaken by the light cavalry here?
Not specifically that I'm aware of. There was a brilliant paper. One of the other things that encouraged me to do this, that Stephen Brumwell gave some years ago at Leeds, and he'd done some work with. There's a, if I recall rightly, it's a professional footballer who's bought some of the land that was then the encampment, and has got very interested in the history and the archaeology. And Stephen gave a summary of that and talked about the training. And if I could find out the details of that, then that might be where the answers lie. Or I'm sure if you were to contact him yourself. There isn't an awful lot about the earliest years of the light cavalry because these are light troops attached to heavy cavalry regiments. I mean, some of them are ultimately regimented themselves to form one of the numbered light dragoon regiments, but they're quite an obscure topic, and I'm that's one of my holes in the research at the moment. They don't play a huge part in these operations. The main moment of glory is when they go riding into Saint Savin on the first attempt, Marlborough's attempt on St Malo, with the grenadiers mounted up behind and go around burning the place. That they actually take some of them. They don't take as many cavalry on the second expedition. My assumption is that they would have just functioned as scouts with the numbers that they have, but they aren't very much mentioned. But no, in terms of exactly how they operated, I'm not able to offer much on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, thanks. Just by way of explanation to the people who are watching live, although I'm putting the questions up on the screen, the people watching this on replay can't see the questions, which is why I'm very annoyingly reading it out as well as you being able to read it for yourselves. So Jonathan's commented that it's been a fascinating talk, and thank you. In this period, did sailors fight ashore in the style of Hornblower? In the style of the Hornblower type raids, as in the Napoleonic era? And also, was there any specific involvement of the Marines?
My impression is that the Navy was mostly just involved in the landing and the re-embarkation operations. I think because there were sufficient numbers of troops embarked, there wasn't a need for blue jacket landing parties. Marines, certainly there are no Marines in the conventional sense at Rochefort the previous year, because they actually have to embark 2 extra battalions of infantry to serve as Marines. I think one of them's the 37th. I can't remember which the other one is. That wasn't the case on these there's the 58 expeditions, which leads me to assume that by this point the warships had received regular Marine contingents, but they aren't mentioned that I've come across yet in the land operations. So I suspect that the army was left to do its thing. I mean, particularly in this case, because the Navy is effectively obliged to pull its own resources back on board ship and move to a new anchorage. I can't imagine that naval or marine contingents would have been left ashore. And equally, the casualty figures for the Navy suggest that we're looking at involvement in the battle at St Cas, but not in the operations prior to that.
Okay. Christopher has commented that these operations deserve to be better known. Are there any depictions of the craft used to convey the cavalry contingent?
There may well be. I'm not a marine historian, maritime historian, so possibly or probably yes, in somewhere like the National Maritime Museum, but it's not something I could describe. My assumption is conventional horse transport ships. I don't believe there was any specialised means of actually getting the horses ashore. Possibly swim ashore. I can't remember. There would be no way of offloading them onto a quayside. So I suspect conventional horse transports to get them close to the beach and then swim ashore from there. But again, that's supposition rather than hard fact.
Okay, and from Phil, in Andrew's research thus far, has he encountered any material that would suggest a specific raiding committee command existed to oversee all of these raids, or if experienced ships and crews were reused for a number of raids during the war? And what amount of amphibious training for the troops was carried out before the actual raids were executed. And he also apologises for a long-winded question, but it's a comprehensive question.
It is. It gave me a chance to think about an answer while you were reading it out as well. So no, there's no problem there. I don't think there was any form of centralised command from the military and naval point of view. The command structure changes through the operation. So it's Mordaunt in 57, then it's Marlborough, then he banked his way to Germany and it's Bly. The naval command swings. It's Hawke initially. There's a whole subplot that probably isn't worth going into. Too lengthy to go into tonight. But essentially, Hawke feels he's been slighted by Commodore Howe being given the inshore squadron and hauls down his flag in a sulk, and Anson has to come out of the Admiralty and take command of the covering fleet. Thinking ahead, it would be interesting to know what lessons Howe learned for working with the army on these operations, because he does that again in the American War. But there doesn't seem to have been any sort of lessons learned exercise in these operations. I haven't got the naval orders of battle sufficiently in my head to tell you whether ships were reused in that respect, and I don't think there's not a great deal of continuity even between 57 and 58 with the troops that are involved. The one regiment that I'm finding crops up everywhere is the 30th that Corporal Todd was serving in. They were on, in the previous war, they were at Lorient as Frampton's 30th of Foot, and then changing colonels as Loudon's. They're at Rochefort. They're on all the 58 operations, and just to cap it all, they then go to Belle-Île at the end of the war and take part in that landing as well. So I think if any of the army units develops an amphibious capability, it's probably that one regiment. But I think that was more by chance and misfortune rather than any attempt to train troops specially for these sort of operations. I don't think training beyond embarking and disembarking, really. There isn't really an expectation, and there isn't sort of an assault landing scenario. Dudley mentioned Aboukir in the Napoleonic Wars, where they're attacking positions on the shore. The idea is to land somewhere safe and sheltered before the French are able to get a force together and then fight in a conventional manner ashore, or even better, in the case of Cherbourg, destroy the target without needing to fight a conventional battle. So I'm not even sure there would have been considered to be a great deal of need for specialist training in that sense.
I need to put my glasses on. I've been so vain so far. Sam asks again, how was intelligence acquired for the descents on the coast about fortifications, etc.? In my research, a Dutch officer offered his knowledge on the defence of Belle-Île in 1759 prior to the joint operation against it in 1761. Was this similar for the earlier descents in 1758?
I think to some extent, I say Rochefort certainly was largely down to a British officer having been there during in the peace. It all seems to have been fairly casual, though. A lot of assumptions are being made. They make a decision as to whether or not to attack Granville by sailing over there and having a look at it, which doesn't suggest a great deal of forward planning. And the whole business of landing on the wrong side of a major river with Bly's operation again suggests a fairly limited grasp of the geography and the situation ashore. So I'm not sure that there was very much of prior intelligence. St Malo had been attacked before in previous wars. It would maybe be a location that certainly the Navy would be expected to have some familiarity with, but I don't think you have the same situation as you do with with Rochefort, and as you're outlining with Belial, where you've got somebody who really knows it, and that helps shape the operation. That this is very much we need to have a crack at this target, and we'll sort of go there and see what happens, which probably helps contribute to the fact that it all ends in a disaster.
Marx made the observation that there is an interesting court-martial concerning Belial in 1761. A number of enlisted men end up bunched up among the rocks on the beach, and their officers are unable to get them moving. Have you come across examples of command difficulties in amphibious assault landings?
Not in the context of these operations, because none of the landings were opposed. I've mentioned in other contexts that discipline doesn't seem to have been great on these operations. So, I mean, it may well be, as I say, in the evacuation operations that, whereas Todd is conveniently blaming a dead general, it may have simply been indiscipline on the troops that caused them to go after the French and expose themselves. I don't know. Again, that's something that really needs going into with some more of the eyewitness accounts. I mean, of course, one of the problems, you've got a dead scapegoat who can't write a report. That really doesn't help shape things. And a lot of the accounts that are written afterwards, certainly from the officers' side of things, are we're heading into pamphlet war territory. So getting to the truth of things there is difficult. But yeah, I think one of the things that I want to look at, because it goes back to sort of one of my reasons for looking at these operations in the first place, is to get a sense of how the British Army was at this era, whether Cumberland's reforms were working, have they kicked in yet, how well the army functioned, and how well it was disciplined and so forth is something that I need to explore. Okay, I think we've come to the end of questions. I need to share with you, Andrew, some of the comments, because there's a lot of people that say, apart from saying thank you very much, a fascinating talk, there are a number of people saying, well, I might be able to help you here and I might be able to help you there. That would be lovely. That was my hope in doing this. I'd be delighted to hear from anybody who's got any suggestions for further lines of inquiry on this. Okay, so now there's a chance to plug something. So I've put up a flyer for a conference that's taking place, and Andrew's going to talk about it. Yes, thank you. So this is shameless plug time. I don't know. Possibly some of the contributors may even be in the audience. But yes, so this is the annual series conference that I run for the Reasons Revolution series that I edit for Hellion. This one's on the 4th of November in Derby, and we're looking at amphibious warfare across the long 18th century. So we've got Cartagena, we've got Lorient that I'm going to be talking about. We go right through the American War, some of the Napoleonic operations. Carol, as mentioned earlier, with her knowledge of Abercrombie's campaigns, looking at Aboukir and the Helder again. And we ultimately end with the shining triumph that was the Walcheren expedition, which I think for all the talk of learning curves in military history, with amphibious warfare, it's a learning roller coaster, because they learn the lessons, they get it right, and then they forget them by the time the war comes around again, and they seem to have to be learnt all over. And it will be interesting to explore with some of the speakers how that has come to be. Why can't the Army and the Navy consistently get it right? But yeah, we'll hear about some of the ones that worked and some of the ones that were utter disasters. So hopefully something for everybody. Great. Well, Andrew, thank you for that. Just to echo everybody's comments in the chat box this evening, it has been a fascinating talk. As I said, I always learn a lot, but these are things that I can stitch into my work. So thank you for that. Next month, Eamon O'Keefe is talking to us. We haven't yet agreed a date. And so please look out for the Society's newsletter and Twitter tweets, etc., where we will confirm the date. And we haven't actually, I think, even agreed a subject, but I'm almost certain it's going to be on musicians of his time. I can confirm that at least, Dudley. Yes, it is musicians, but we haven't had a title yet. Yeah. Okay.
Andrew, thanks again. And thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. For those that are watching this on replay, I hope you will also enjoy it. And we'll see you again, hopefully, next month. Good night, everybody.
Night all. Thank you.